You've been in that conversation. Someone opens their mouth and words just fall out. Unfiltered, unconsidered, completely hollow. No pause, no thought. Just noise dressed up as communication. And you sit there, watching it happen, and something inside you quietly breaks. Not from anger, from exhaustion. Because you've been watching this your entire life. People who never seem to struggle with what to say. People who never hesitate, never second guess, never feel the weight of a sentence before they speak it. They just talk, confidently, loudly, often completely wrong. And somehow, they're the ones the room listens to. This video is not a lecture on communication skills. It is not going to tell you to be more confident or to put yourself out there. What it is going to do is something far more unsettling. It's going to explain, using the most brutally honest philosopher who ever lived, why the people who talk the most usually understand the least, and why the silence of a thinking person will almost always be mistaken for weakness by people who have never once sat alone with a thought uncomfortable enough to change them. If you've ever felt like you were living in a world that rewards speed over depth, noise over truth, and confidence over correctness, this is for you. There's a specific kind of loneliness that nobody talks about. It's not the loneliness of having no friends. It's not the loneliness of being alone in a room. It's the loneliness of being in a room full of people who are speaking and realizing that almost nothing being said is actually true. You've felt it. At work, when someone who clearly hasn't thought a problem through for more than 30 seconds starts explaining their solution with absolute certainty. At school, when the person talking the loudest gets called smart while you're still processing the actual complexity of the question. At family dinners, when someone confidently announces an opinion they picked up from a headline, and the table nods along like scripture was just read. And you don't say anything, not because you don't have thoughts. You have too many. You're still weighing them. You're still asking yourself, is this true? Is this complete? Am I missing something? That's the curse. You care whether what you say is accurate, and that care costs you time. And in a world that moves at the speed of reaction, time is the one thing you're never given. So you watch, you listen, you process, and then, by the time you've formed something real to say, the conversation has already moved on, carried by the people who never stopped to think in the first place. The worst part? You've started to wonder if something is wrong with you. There isn't. But the world has done a very good job of making you feel like there is. Here's what nobody tells you. The person who speaks without thinking isn't just careless. They're operating from a completely different relationship with reality. When you hesitate before speaking, you are doing something most people are neurologically incapable of doing consistently. You are checking your words against the world before you release them. You are asking, internally, is this actually true? And that question, that single quiet question, separates intellectual depth from intellectual noise. The person who doesn't ask that question isn't lazy. They're not even always stupid. They are simply dominated by something that Schopenhauer spent his entire life trying to describe: something that moves beneath thought, something older than language, older than reason, older than civilization itself. He called it the will. And once you understand what he meant, you will never look at a mindless conversation the same way again. Arthur Schopenhauer was not a pleasant man. He was arrogant, isolated, convinced he was surrounded by intellectual inferiors. And this is the uncomfortable part. He was often right. He didn't care about being liked. He cared about being accurate. And that distinction, he believed, was exactly what separated the philosopher from the crowd. In his masterwork, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer argued something deeply strange and deeply disturbing. That underneath everything you think of as your mind, your opinions, your beliefs, your sense of self, there is a blind, irrational force that he called the will. This isn't your conscious intention. This isn't the you that makes decisions. This is something deeper and older. It is pure drive, pure impulse, wanting without reason, moving without direction. The will doesn't think. It just pushes. And here is where it becomes relevant to your life and to every conversation you've ever felt trapped in. Schopenhauer believed that most people are almost entirely governed by this force, that the vast majority of human behavior, including human speech, is not the product of thought. It is the product of impulse dressed up as thought. When someone speaks before thinking, they are not expressing a conclusion. They are expressing the will. They are venting pressure, seeking attention, asserting dominance, filling silence, all disguised as conversation. The words are just the exhaust. And Schopenhauer had a very specific, very cutting word for the people most consumed by this pattern. He called them ordinary, not stupid, not evil, ordinary. People who have never once caught themselves in the act of existing, who have never looked at their own thoughts with enough distance to ask, where did this come from? Is this actually mine? Is this even true? Now here is where it gets darker. Schopenhauer didn't just say that ordinary people speak before thinking. He said that most people are not actually capable of sustained original thought at all. That what passes for thinking in most social situations is really just memory retrieval, reaction, pattern matching. People hear a word and a familiar response fires, not from reflection, but from habit. He wrote, and this line should stay with you, that the brain is not the master of the will, but its servant. That reason, for most people, is not a guide. It is a storyteller. It takes what the will has already decided and constructs a narrative that makes it sound like it was reasoned, which means when someone is confidently, loudly wrong, they are not reasoning poorly. They are not reasoning at all. They have reached a conclusion by instinct, by impulse, by social mimicry, and then assembled the appearance of logic around it after the fact. This is what makes it so difficult to argue with them. You cannot out-reason someone who was never reasoning to begin with. You are playing chess against someone who thinks they're playing checkers, and who will never understand why you keep looking frustrated. And here is the point that cuts deepest. The people most dominated by this pattern are usually the most confident, because confidence, in the Schopenhauerian sense, is not a sign of knowledge. It is a sign of low internal friction, of not being troubled by doubt, of never having enough self-awareness to realize that your certainty might be a symptom of your blindness. The person who has thought deeply almost always speaks with more hesitation than the person who hasn't thought at all. And the world, reliably, mistakes hesitation for weakness and confidence for intelligence. So how does this work exactly? Why do some people speak before thinking while others are cursed, or gifted, depending on how you look at it, with the opposite problem? There are several invisible mechanisms at work. Not one of them is talked about honestly. The first is the absence of internal silence. Thought requires a pause, a real pause, not the brief breath between sentences, but the kind of inner stillness where you actually interrogate your own ideas before they leave your mouth. For most people, that silence never comes. Their minds are not quiet enough to hear themselves think. They are moving constantly from stimulus to response, like a reflex arc that has never been interrupted. The impulsive speaker doesn't experience the gap between impulse and expression, because the gap, for them, doesn't exist. The second is social reward conditioning. From a very early age, most social environments reward speed over accuracy. In classrooms, the first hand up gets the praise. In conversations, the loudest voice sets the tone. In meetings, the person who speaks first usually controls the frame. The brain learns this, and once learned, it optimizes for it. Speaking fast, sounding certain, projecting confidence, these behaviors are socially reinforced so deeply and for so long that they stop feeling like performances. They become identity. The third is the confusion of familiarity with truth. When something feels familiar, when an idea matches what you already believe, what your community already believes, what you've always believed, it triggers a sensation of recognition that is almost identical to the sensation of understanding. The impulsive speaker does not distinguish between these two feelings. They feel familiar, therefore they feel right, and right things get said. Loudly, immediately. The fourth is the absence of intellectual loneliness. This may sound strange, but the thinker suffers in a way that the impulsive speaker never does. They spend time alone with ideas that disturb them. They sit with thoughts that don't resolve easily. They feel the discomfort of not knowing, and they stay in it rather than escaping into sound. This tolerance for unresolved complexity is what builds genuine depth, but it is genuinely uncomfortable. Most people avoid it, not because they are weak, but because no one ever modeled what it looks like to sit with uncertainty without immediately needing to speak it out of existence. The fifth is ego as a communication strategy. Schopenhauer was sharply aware of something that modern psychology has since confirmed. Speaking is often not about conveying information. It is about securing status. When someone speaks confidently in a group, they are not primarily trying to be helpful or accurate. They are asserting dominance. They are making themselves visible. They are managing how they are perceived. And because this drive operates beneath conscious awareness, because the will, as Schopenhauer described it, is pre-rational, The person doing it usually has no idea this is what's happening. They genuinely believe they are just talking. The sixth is the mirror problem. When people who speak without thinking are finally confronted by someone who points out that what they said was wrong, they rarely update. They defend. Because the statement they made was never really an intellectual position. It was an expression of self. To say you were wrong is not, to them, a correction. It is an attack. And you cannot correct an impulse by offering evidence. You can only embarrass it. Which is why people who actually know things learn, eventually, to say less. The seventh mechanism is perhaps the most painful. It is the sheer invisibility of depth. The person who has thought carefully about something carries that complexity internally. It doesn't display well. It sounds uncertain. It comes with qualifications. It often leads to conclusions that are harder to say out loud than they are to think. The person who hasn't thought about something carries nothing internally, but they broadcast everything externally. And in a world built for surface-level scanning, the surface is all that gets seen. Depth, by its nature, is hidden. And most people don't know to look for what they can't see. Now let's talk about what this does to a person. If you are someone who thinks before speaking, who genuinely cannot open your mouth until something true is behind the words, then you have spent years paying a social tax that others are never charged. You've been passed over, not because you were less capable, but because you were less visible. Because visibility in most human environments belongs to the person who moves fastest, and you were moving carefully. You've watched people with less understanding get more credit. You've felt the specific frustration of watching someone confidently articulate a half-formed idea and have the room receive it as wisdom. You've held back something real because you were still refining it, and then heard someone else say a worse version of it loudly and get applauded. That stays with you. It starts to create a belief, quiet, persistent, deeply unfair, that maybe careful thinking is a disadvantage, that maybe the world doesn't want truth, it wants performance. And maybe you've been playing the wrong game this entire time. Some people, under that pressure, learn to perform. They get faster. They train themselves to speak before the thought is ready, because they've learned that ready thoughts arrive too late. And every time they do it, they feel something in them compromise, because they know the difference between expressing something true and expressing something fast. They know what it costs. Others withdraw entirely. They stop speaking in groups. They become observers, brilliant, resentful observers, who watch conversations happen to them rather than through them. And the silence that was once a sign of their depth becomes, over time, a wall between them and the world. This is what Schopenhauer understood about intellectual isolation. It is not neutral. It accumulates. It becomes a posture, and a posture becomes a life. But here is where Schopenhauer's philosophy stops being just a diagnosis and becomes something you can actually use. He believed, and this is crucial, that the capacity to escape the dominance of the will was the rarest thing in the human world. Most people never achieve it. Not because they can't, but because it requires something almost no one is willing to do: to genuinely observe yourself, to watch your own thoughts from a distance, to ask not just "what do I think," but "why do I think it? What is pushing this? Where is this coming from?" That capacity, what Schopenhauer called aesthetic or philosophical contemplation, is not something you can fake. It cannot be performed, and it cannot be taken from you. The person who speaks before thinking will never suffer the loneliness you carry, but they will also never experience what you experience in those moments when thought actually resolves. When something clicks, when a complex question finally yields a real answer. When you understand something, not because you were told, but because you worked through it. That is not a consolation prize. That is the entire thing. The misunderstanding that has been causing you pain is this: you assumed that the goal was to be heard. And in most human environments, the impulsive speaker will always win that game. They are built for it. They are trained for it. They are rewarded for it. But being heard is not the same as being understood. And being understood is not the same as being right. You have spent your life trying to be right. That is not a weakness. That is the rarest form of intellectual honesty that exists. Schopenhauer himself lived most of his life without recognition. His magnum opus was ignored for decades. He lectured to empty halls while Hegel, a man he viewed as a fraud, filled auditoriums. He was not celebrated in his time, and then, slowly, the world caught up. Not because he got louder, because he was right. Here is the final truth this video is going to leave you with. You are not slow. You are not behind. You are not losing a game you should be winning. You are playing a different game entirely. And most people around you don't even know it exists. The person who speaks before thinking is not your enemy. They are simply someone who has never been disturbed enough by their own thoughts to stop and examine them. That is not strength. That is insulation. And insulation is comfortable, right up until the moment reality pierces it. And it always does. Your discomfort, your hesitation, your internal friction, your inability to just say whatever comes to mind, is not a flaw in your wiring. It is the wiring of someone who takes reality seriously. In a world full of people who have never once sat alone with an idea long enough for it to change them, that is not ordinary. And Schopenhauer, who was many things but never dishonest, would tell you, ordinary is the only thing worth refusing to be. The noise will always be louder. The noise will always move faster. The noise will always get more attention. But the noise has never once been what remembered comment will, if you recognize this pattern in your life.